Bruce. Morning. We will. I'm not. That's why I said I will.
Are we on right now?
Yes. With sound and everything. I think. I think my sound. I think the sound's on.
Yeah, I like those better.
I love these.
See, I got those, but they were a little bit cheaper than the other ones. Yeah, the other ones were like mine.
Check.
And they're creamy.
Yeah.
Did you put the Christmas tree up for long?
It's true when they say you get over it.
It'll be school days soon,
Yeah.
depending on what you do.
I know what I
It's
got
like-
for-
Yeah.
It's like a kid asked me the other day, he's like, do you think that the school went by, or this school year went quick? I said, I think it felt like it did. We've got 1 year or 1 week left.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to think about not only like school stuff, but just to think, like you're talking about almost a month away for the conference. That just,
Yeah.
didn't we just have that?
Yeah, it's just really.
It seems, I don't know. I do want to bring in that PA microphone or the system thing to double check, make sure everything works. And then we'll get that piano keyboard again.
The doo-wop shop's not one out of business, is it?
The doo-wop shop? Not that I know of. Why? I did find out how much that little keyboard was, though.
How much?
Let's just say $25 to rent. It's a pretty decent price for a weekend. So
Yeah.
Was it $1,000?
no, it was the one I found one. I think it was like $4.99 or something like that. So
Well, and renting it, you're not worried about if it breaks, warranty stuff.
yeah,
I mean, it's
to replace it
for
and
$25.
yeah.
For a week?
For a weekend. Yeah, I mean, technically we get it for a week. So I mean, so that week prior to, we'll test everything out, make sure everything works too. So
Don't ask.
Are you seriously blaming me for that?
that sounds just like kids at school, like it's his fault. Anyway,
Oh, and we've, well, we didn't discuss it with anybody, but we thought it would be cool. Hoggy and ice cream, if, people wanted to go. Last year, like Richard and Cynthia and all them wanted to go down to the Capitol. Like,
Yeah.
they wanted to go.
Yeah.
So, if people want to go somewhere this year, we could take them. I was
For that
thinking
Saturday.
Salado and or Hoggy's ice cream.
Yeah, that would be nice.
we finally got to go to Hoggies a week or so ago.
Yeah, haven't you been?
No, we went down, they were open,
Oh,
when we went down there that one day.
It's real tiny, but they've got,
I know where it's
the
at,
upstairs
yeah.
part, like you can go upstairs.
Mm.
It's all open though, really cute,
Wow.
yeah.
I've seen pictures on, we go by there, but
They just put out a picture of ice cream.
so yeah, that's something that we're going to be looking at
Some idea, yeah.
doing to have some ice cream. Go down there Saturday, probably. But yeah, conference June 21st, 22nd, 23rd. We don't have anybody that's signed up online yet, and they probably won't. And that's okay. I mean, it'd make it easier for us to schedule foods and whatnot. But I think we'll have a bigger crowd than we had last year.
Also, I'm working
Yeah.
on this at churches that you can send letters to.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Some of them in Louisville, some in Lex,
Yeah.
and Richmond.
Okay.
And that's gonna be one of your main goals as soon as school is out. And
Yeah.
then this week, I know you're wanting to get on that.
Yeah.
Send out some letters of invitation.
Yeah. And then I've got a list of other people that I want to send invitations to as well. So I'll get on that probably this week while my kids are taking their final exams.
By the way, living on my salary only, but that's not ever gonna happen.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
Yeah. Greg, I'm not putting the thing that we're live.
Really?
Okay.
Did you find it?
No.
No?
Are we on? Just go.
I guess. I guess we are.
Sorry.
Did you get it? Okay. So let's see. So conference coming up next month. So we've got some work to do there. Yeah, it's towards the end of July. I'd like to be able to go to the one in Ohio, but it's this weekend, and I have to go to graduation. It's always the same weekend, so we'll never get to go, but it's all good. All right.
And we have quite a few kids here, I believe, so we will,
I'll bring the vinegar up.
Not sure why they're asleep. All right. So today what I want to do is to try, and so hopefully it'll work this time. We're going to try for, I think, the third time maybe the fourth time. Anyway, the fourth watch. Okay. So we're going to take a look at the fourth watch and read through, go through a little study here on the fourth watch. Because I think we've tried to do this before. The last time the sound wasn't great, which is okay because when I was listening to it, I was like, I think there's a better way to do this, so I reworked it, and so we'll see if it's any better. All right, so what we're going to do, let's start off. Let's go to Mark chapter 13. We're going to start in Mark chapter 13. I'm trying to think. We've got the conference coming up next month. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to announce. Keep Dino and his family in your prayers, what they're having to deal with and go through. So on her shoulder, yeah, all his health issues. So. No, I think he said that they're calling it an elective surgery right now, so their insurance won't have to pay for it. I think that's what he said. All right. So Mark chapter 13, we're just going to start reading with verse 34. And we'll see how far we get through this. We should be able to finish this up today, hopefully. Mark chapter 13, we're going to read verses 34 through 37 to get going. So Mark chapter 13, verse 34. For the Son of Man is a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto you all, watch. Father, we thank you for the opportunity we have to study your word. As we take a look at some issues here and the timing of things with what was going on during Christ's earthly ministry and his second coming, that we come to a knowledge and understanding of your word rightly divided. We look at it that way, that we come to a clearer knowledge and understanding of your word and the timeline of things that you've established, and how those things have changed through the dispensation of the grace of God. We thank you for this day. We thank you for your word, and we thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so one of the first things, and I just realized this board's not going to be big enough, but that's okay. That's well, I can, but here's the thing. So that's like when we were in Fox River Bible Church. I was about 40 minutes into the message, and I said, all right, the first thing we need to do, I said, you probably don't want to hear that 35 minutes into a message. I didn't go that long. It was a little over an hour. But anyway, so that's one of those things, those times that you don't really want to think about that. So here's what I want to do. First of all, notice in verse 35. And we're going to take a look at the context here of what's going on and get an idea of what Christ is dealing with. But notice in verse 34, he says, "For the Son of Man is a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch." Notice he says, "Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh." And he gives us four things here. He says, at even, and how do I want to do this? We'll do it this way. At even, then he says at midnight. Okay. Then, or at the cock crowing. Or in the morning. All right, so there's four things that we notice here that we're dealing with: the even, the midnight, the cock crowing, and the morning. And there's some things that we can take a look at as you go through here. You've got 6 p.m. here where it switches over to the even. Then you've got 9 p.m. Up through 12 a.m. And then at the cock crowing would be 3 a.m. And then 6 a.m. over there. Which, one of those things, when we talk about it, we're going to be able to lay some things down on here. So this would be considered the first watch of the night. This would be considered the second watch of the night. This would be the third watch of the night, and then fourth watch. And there's some things that we're going to have as we go through here. The fourth watch, because that's what we're dealing with, and of course the 4 watches are going to lead up to something, but that fourth watch is going to be the main issue that we're going to look at. So there's some other things that we could take along these same lines. Do you all remember when we talked about a few weeks ago? You had 12 p.m. and then we had 3 p.m. and then we have 6 p.m. And we talked about from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. during that time period was when darkness was on the earth, when Christ died. And, we talked about the crucifixion at that time, and they had to take him down off the cross before that next day started. So there's some other things that we can get into with that you have the death, burial, and then the resurrection we know took place a little bit later on, but because it was 3 days later. But there were some other things that we talked about with that. So what I want to do is take a look at some things with these 4 watches, okay? And that's kind of the main thing that I want us to take a look at. So get the context of what's going on. Let's back up to chapter 13, verse 14, okay? So chapter 13, verse 14, what I want us to get is the context of what's going on leading up to the verses that we actually read, okay? Notice, in Mark chapter 13, verse 14, he says, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house, neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. And let him that is in the field not turn back again for to take up his garment. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that gave suck in those days. And pray that your fight be not in the winter. For in those days shall affliction such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be. And except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh shall be saved, but the elect's sake, whom he hath chosen, he hath shortened the days. And then, if any man shall say to you, Lo, here is Christ, or Lo, there is Christ, or he is there, believe him not. For false Christs and false prophets shall rise, and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, and if it were possible, even the elect. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. But in those days after the tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then shall he send his angels, and shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. Now learn a parable of the fig tree when her branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves. Ye know that summer is near. So ye in like manner, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know that it is nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. Take ye heed, watch and pray, for ye know not when the time is." And then we get the verses that we talked about before. So what's his issue here is he's telling them what? I need you to what? Watch and pray. Okay? So there's some things that we see that's taking place here. He says in verse 35, "Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, at even or at midnight or at cock crowing or in the morning." So they're not sure which one of those times that he might be coming back. And that's one of those things that we want to make sure that we see what's going on here. There's some other things that we're going to be able to get into here. When we start off in verse 14, that abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, what he's talking about is there's something that's taking place during the tribulation period. Okay? And at a particular time during that tribulation period, as he puts it here, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. Okay? He says, let him that readeth understand. So he's saying, if you want to understand it, go back and read the book of Daniel, and you'll be able to find out what he's talking about there. All right, so there's some things. We're going to take a look at what that might be here in a little bit as we go on. So what's he telling them here to do is to what? Watch and pray. Don't fall asleep. Okay? So there's a few things that we want to make sure that we get. We're right here in Mark, so drop down to chapter 14. chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Let's take a look. Let's start off in verse 26. This is right on the heels of the Passover, the institution of the Lord's Supper. When we get to verse 26, notice it says, "And when they had sung an hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives, and Jesus saith unto them, All ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee. But Peter said unto him, Although all shall be offended, yet will not I. And Jesus saith unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this day, even this night, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice." So there's a couple things that we've got going on here. And he says, before the cock crows 3 times. So when does the cock crowing take place? Is going to be over here at this particular time. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. Keep on going. Verse 31. "But he spake the more vehemently, If I should die with thee, I will not deny thee in any wise. Likewise also said they all. And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he saith to his disciples, Sit ye here, while I shall pray." All right, so there's a few things that we notice that he says here to them. He says what? I want you to sit here while I go pray. Okay, notice verse 33, "And he taketh with him Peter and James and John, and began to be sore amazed, and to be very heavy. And he saith unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death." Notice what's he say? "Tarry ye and" what? "Watch." Okay. So as we continue on, notice in verse 35, "And he went forward a little, and fell on the ground, and prayed, that if it were possible the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. And he cometh and findeth them" what? Are they watching? No, they're asleep, right? So then we keep on going. "Findeth them sleeping, and saith unto Peter, Simon, sleepest thou? Couldest not thou watch 1 hour? Notice what he says. "Watch ye and pray, lest ye enter in temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, and spake the same words. And when he returned, he found them what? Asleep again. What did he tell them to do? I want you all to watch. Stay awake, don't sleep. And then there's something else that takes here that I find very interesting. Verse 41, he says, "And he cometh the third time, and saith unto them, Sleep on now, and take your rest. It is enough, the hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." So the first 2 times he comes back, he says what? I want you to watch and pray. Watch. Then the last time he comes back, he says, go ahead and sleep. Go ahead and rest, right? And because he knows the time's coming for what's getting ready to take place. So, let's take a look at something else. Go over to John chapter 6. And so I just want to get us in the mindset of really what's going on leading up to this, and kind of see why we're talking about these things. So, there's a few things that we want to make sure that we get here. John chapter 6, verse 15. All right, we're going to take a look at some other passages that go along with this, so we can get some more information that goes along with this information. So, in John chapter 6, the first part here, you've got Jesus Christ feeding 5,000. All right, the fishes and loaves. And so then there's a reason why he does that miracle. But then we get to verse 15. So this is right after this. Notice in verse 15. "When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. And when even was come, his disciples went down unto the sea." So I want you to think. Where are we in this time frame right here would be at the even, right? So you notice he says, and when even was come, his disciples went down unto the sea. So there's some things that we can talk about with this, that sea, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more here in just a little bit. But notice, and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. So you've got sea, you also have dark, right? Now, was Jesus with them? No. Notice in verse 18, and the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. But he saith unto them, It is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. Okay? So then what happens is they see Jesus Christ what? Walking on the sea toward them. All right? And what did they do? They gladly receive him into the ship. So there's a few things that we see here. Jesus Christ wasn't with them, and it was dark, and they're dealing with this tempestuous sea, right? So go get Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. So Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 through 21, we see that he feeds the 5,000 with the fishes and loaves, the 2 fishes and the 5 loaves. You get down to verse 22. Notice what we have here in verse 22. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when evening was come, he was there alone. So we see the same idea. At evening, he's there alone. He goes up into a mountain to pray. All right? And so there's some other things that we have that we can think about when we think about that. When they're here in this ship, and he's off by himself, he goes up into a mountain to pray. So the one thing that I kind of relate that to is when he goes up after the ascension. Right? He goes off, he's by himself, he's not with them, and they're down here in this ship. And you think of it that way, right? So they're down here at the evening, during the evening. Notice in verse 24, but the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. All right? So there's some things that I want us to see what's going on. So in the evening, where is he? He's off alone, by himself praying. They're down here dealing with the sea, right? And so then, if you want to think of the sea here, they're out here on this boat. Shouldn't be an artist. They're out there here on this boat by themselves, and Jesus is out. He's up in a mountain, right? They're out on the sea, and he's up in the mountain. And so then there's some things that we notice here. Notice what he says in verse 24. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. Notice, and in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. So when is it that Jesus shows up? We didn't get this in John 6, right? It didn't tell us that when he came. When is it that he comes walking on the sea is when? That 4th watch, okay? So you have Jesus Christ here walking towards them on the sea, all right? So from the evening until that time, you've got this going on. But that key there is in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them. Notice, walking on the sea. So there's a couple things that I want you all to get real quick. and this is the part that I was worried about I wasn't going to run out of room on, and that's okay. We'll see how this works. So, get my other thing here. You all remember when we talked about when we all get to heaven last year when we did that video, and because we had to do that for the summer conference, and we recorded it here and all that. And you remember when we talked about the structure of the universe, right? So you remember when we went through Hebrews and we found out that God gave to Moses a picture of the true tabernacle, right? And that true tabernacle is a picture of the universe as God created the universe. True tabernacle, and what He's done is He gave to Moses a picture of it and says, I want you to build this tabernacle here on earth, and I want you to model it after the tabernacle. So there are some things that we talked about with that. So in that structure of the earth, you remember when we talked about the fact that when all this stuff here was water, and then we go through Genesis and we find out that God creates or separates firmament, and then you got the earth here. You had firmament up here, you have firmament here, where He put the stars and the seas and the moon and all that stuff, and we talked about that. And He said that in Genesis He talks about the fact that He separates the waters below and the waters above. We talked about that. I don't know if you remember that or not, but we did. All right, so there's a few things that I want us to get as we go through here. Go back real quick to Daniel. Get Daniel chapter 10. Because it's one of those things that's really kind of fascinating as you go through reading some of these things. And I don't know if you all remember on Wednesday night when we're going through and we finished up the overview of the Bible, and we got to Revelation 21, and it talks about the new heaven and the new earth, because the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and then it says, and there was no more sea. All right, so there's a reason why that's no longer going to be there. So notice, I want you to look at something real quick. Daniel chapter 10. We'll leave it that way. Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10, let's start off in verse 8. Okay? Daniel chapter 10, verse 8. Therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me, for my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the voice of His words, and when I heard the voice of His words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. And behold, an hand touched me, which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands. And He said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright. For unto thee am I now sent. And when He had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. Notice, then said He unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand, and chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. So then, one of the things as we go through here, everybody always goes back to this prayer and says, when Daniel prays, it's 21 days before he gets his answer. So sometimes you just have to wait on God's timing, and God's timing is not our timing, and they use that to ruin prayer, which is a really great thing. And they try to make it about, well, you just don't know what God's doing, you just got to wait around for Him. That's not true, and they misuse what's going on here. But I want you to notice some things. This angel, because that's who we're dealing with here. In fact, I would say that it's Gabriel, but that's me. He says, For from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. So, did God hear Daniel's prayer when he first prayed the prayer? Absolutely. Then why is it that it took him some time to get there? Notice in verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. So the reason that he didn't show up for 21 days is not because it was God's timing, but because of why? The prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now, you have an angel here, and he's talking about the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But notice, but lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. So what we have here is you have Daniel here on the earth, and you have the angel Gabriel, who I would say is Gabriel here. He comes down to talk to Daniel. But it takes him a little bit of time because for 21 days he's going through that water, that sea, the deep. All right? When we talk about in Genesis 1 where he talks about that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and he talks about the deep there, what takes place is you have those positions of ranks and authority, and you have there specifically the prince of the kingdom of Persia. He's not talking about coming here on earth and having to fight through some guy. He's talking about he had to come through, and he had an angel, one of the fallen angels who lives in that water, withstand him for 21 days. And then Michael comes and helps him, and then he stays there and he says, now I've come. So if you misunderstand what's going on in Daniel chapter 10, then you're going to lose some things about a whole bunch of stuff. One, prayer isn't just waiting on God for him to do what he said he's going to do. There were things that they had to deal with that you and I don't have to deal with today. But there are things that they had to deal with, that those angels had to deal with in order to come down as messengers to God's people. They had to go through that water, that deep. That's why you had that, notice, sea. And one of the things you find out in that water, according to Genesis chapter 1, is it's dark. From the very top all the way to the very bottom. Same way it is down here. And everybody says, you look out in the universe, why is the universe dark? It's surrounded by darkness. All right? And there's some things that's going on there. So that's some of the stuff that I want you to think about as we go through this. That sea that God gets rid of in Revelation 21, the reason there's no more sea is he gets rid of that water. And those princes of those kingdoms in those waters is what Gabriel was fighting against to get to Daniel. And he says, Michael came and helped me out, and now I'm here, and I'm here to tell you that this is something that you need to know. All right, so if you miss what's really going on in Daniel chapter 10 right there, and you try to make it, well, you just wait on God, you're missing a whole bunch of stuff here. A couple other things real quick, and I don't have this in the notes or anything, but those positions out there. You remember when Christ takes and for lack of better terms, now I lost that term. You remember when he cast out devils out of people and they went into the swine? Yeah, I didn't want to say exorcism because that's not what it is. But you remember when he cast out demons out of the people and they went into the swine? You remember what the swine did? They ran to the what? The water, because that's where they are. You think about some of that stuff, and Satan, that's where he lives, that's where he dwells, that's who he is in that dark water spot. That's his kingdom. That's where he's ruling and reigning from today. That sea, the darkness. And so then what I want you to see here is the reason that they're on this sea being tossed to and fro is because that's who they're dealing with, is that guy right there. All right? And if you miss what Daniel 10 is really dealing with, and you just make it about God's timing, then you come here and you have no clue what's going on with the sea. The purpose of them being on the sea is saying, who's in charge during the time that they're in this sea? Think of it that way. All right? Go back to Matthew 14. In Matthew chapter 14, we're going to go back to Matthew 14. There's some things here that we've not gotten yet. Remember, we left off in verse 25 where it says, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. So here they are on the sea, they're floating along, and then in the fourth watch, they see Christ walking on the sea. All right? So then, notice, and when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. So not only did they see Jesus walking on the water, you know, everybody talks about that one, but a lot of people don't talk about the fact that Peter walks on the water. And even in my notes, I've got sort of, right? Because what happens is when Peter starts walking on the water, notice verse 30, but when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately, how soon? Did he have to wait on God's timing? He says, immediately, Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. All right? So then there's something that takes place over here where they see Christ. Here, what's Christ do? Goes into a mountain to pray. Well, what happens over here is what? Christ comes down and he's walking towards them while they're on that sea. And so then there's some things that we see starting to kind of take place as we look through this, hopefully. So you've got this storm that they're dealing with here that we want to make sure that we see. Notice, go over real quick, Mark chapter 6. Now, one of the things I do want to mention, the timing of the death, burial, and resurrection. I'm not saying that it goes along with this timeline, obviously, because there were 3 days between this and this. But kind of keeping these things in mind as we go through. What was the next thing? What was the next thing on the original prophetic time calendar after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ would have been the tribulation period? All right. Well, we know that didn't take place, and we know the reason why is because Christ on the cross says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they were granted a 1-year-ish period of time where they had a chance to see if they were going to bring forth fruit. All right? And so then a couple other things that we see there. So Christ is out here. He's sitting on the throne, right? And at the end of Acts chapter 7, what is it that we see? Well, at the end of Acts chapter 7, what we see is Stephen getting stoned to death. He looks up and he sees Christ standing. And then we can search the scriptures and we find out the reason that Christ stands is to come back and make war and judgment and all that stuff, and completely different than how he was when he first came. All right. So then you've got this storm that's raging on the sea, and the disciples are afraid. Christ shows up. Notice Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. We see this is we see the same thing taking place here. Mark chapter 6, verse 45, it says, "And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and go to the other side before unto Bethesda, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling in rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by him." Notice, that one says what? About the fourth watch. The other verses we found out it said what? In the fourth watch. So then there's a period of time there prior to or during that fourth watch when they see Jesus Christ walking toward them. All right? And so then there's some other correlations that we're going to see as we go through this. Then he continues on down. The wind ceased, and they're sore amazed in themselves beyond measure and wondered. All right, go to John chapter 9. Some other things that we should know, I guess. John chapter 9, start off in verse 1 here. John chapter 9, verse 1. "And Jesus passed by, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Notice, I work the works of him that sent me while it is day. Notice, the night cometh when no man can work." So one of the things that we know about Jesus Christ is he is what? The light of the world. Well, when you take that light out, what happens? Darkness. And so one of the things that we see up here, even in the original, well, I shouldn't say the original, but in during the creation, those 6 creation days, we see that darkness was upon the face of the deep, and that darkness there. What is darkness? Darkness, you think darkness is the absence of light. Okay? You don't have to generate darkness. You turn these lights off, shut these blinds, it's going to get dark. Especially when it gets dark at nighttime, you don't have to create, or you don't have to make darkness. In fact, we have to do something to get darkness to go away. One of those is we raise the windows and turn the lights on. Right? It's the same kind of idea with cold and heat. But if light's gone, what happens? You have darkness. So then, with the absence of light, notice he says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man work. So you have light, you have day, and then darkness, you have night. All right. So that should make us remind ourselves of something that takes place. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, starting verse 2 here. Notice, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it says, And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Well, notice when we see this, what do we have in verse 2 is what? Darkness. And God says, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Notice, does it say that God says anything about the darkness being good? No. The good there is the light. Notice, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So you see, light goes with day, night goes with darkness, and we see that He separates those two from the very beginning. He makes a distinction between those two things. Now, go get Daniel chapter 7 real quick. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, notice verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. All right, so there's a couple of different ways you could take this great sea. You can either say, well, that's the Mediterranean Sea based upon the book of Numbers, or you can say, what some people say is the sea is just talking about mankind, which I don't see that at all. Or you can think of the Great Sea as this, which I would say might be in lines with that sea that we have here. All right, what is it that's very boisterous on this sea while they're in that ship was the wind, right? One of the things that you had there. So here you have in Daniel chapter 7 verse 2, he talks about, behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from another. Where is it that they come up from? The sea. All right. Now again, you could think of that as the Mediterranean Sea. You could think of it as that sea that was no longer going to be necessary in Revelation 22 or 21, when God does away with the old heaven and the old earth and creates a new heaven and a new earth. And so then we can take a look at that. Or if you want to think of that as the Mediterranean Sea, however you want to think about that. My thing is what I want to do here is let's think of it as that same thing, that we have that great sea there. Well, what comes out of that is what? Four beasts come out of that sea, all right, during that wind. And so then as we go through, we're going to find out that there's some kingdoms that he's dealing with in Daniel chapter 7 that we've got to make sure that we keep in mind as well. Go get Matthew 24. Matthew chapter 24. Let's start off here, start off in verse 1. All right. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, Seek ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So where is it that they are right here in verse 3 is where? On the Mount of Olives. And we see we're going to see some things here in just a little bit. Notice in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. Notice, all these are the beginning of sorrows. So there's a time when these sorrows begin. Right? Drop down to, well, let's keep on going. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Notice, and if this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. So you've got some things that's going on here, right? You have, he says, if you endure to the end, then what's going to happen? The same shall be saved. And if this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, notice, and then the end shall come. So you have an end of whatever it is that he's dealing with here. And so then he keeps on going, and in verse 15, notice in verse 15, which is what we read earlier. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. All right. So one of the things that we see about what Daniel the prophet's talking about is what? Well, if you go back to Daniel, you find out that there's what? 70 weeks determined upon thy people and upon thy city. You have 69 of those leads us up to the cross of Christ, which means that there's 1 week left. Well, that week happens to be that tribulation period. And so then what he says here in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation take place, which is exactly halfway through that tribulation period, you've got the 3.5 years prior to that, and you have the 3.5 years after that. When that abomination of desolation takes place in the midst of that week, because that's what Daniel talks about, in the midst of that week is when that takes place. That's when, as Paul talks about, the man of sin shall be revealed as the son of perdition. All right? So then, as we go down through here, notice drop down to verse 20. He says, But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world. So, you think you think things are bad now, right? For 3.5 years, they're going to think things are really bad. And then he talks about, and he says, For then shall great tribulation, such as was not seen since the world began. Here you have great tribulation. And however bad they think it's going to be here, it's going to be even worse over there. something that's not being seen, notice what he says. Such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. So you have what Christ talks about is a great tribulation here, and he says that's you've not seen anything like this since you saw at the beginning of the world. Now, that brings up a whole nother discussion about, well, what is it that he's talking about since the beginning of the world? Well, there's a couple things you can think about. What were things that took place since the beginning of the world? Well, you've got the flood of Noah. That was pretty bad, right? Then you have Tower of Babel, things that take place. You can look through the Old Testament scriptures and find some stuff out. But notice he says, "For then there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world." So there's something since the beginning of the world. The beginning of the world, something took place, and since then, nothing's been as bad as what they're going to have to witness out there. And as you go on down, keep on going. Drop down to verse 27. Verse 27. Verse 27. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For whosoever the carcass is, there will be eagles, there will the eagles be gathered together. Notice, immediately after the tribulation of those days. When is it that we've seen that word immediately so far? Well, when Christ is out here and it says immediately he reaches down and picks up Peter, right? So then what we see is there's a correlation between these watches and the storm where Christ calms the sea and this tribulation period. Right? So we see that these things are kind of starting to come together where we can see this. When is it that Christ immediately helps Peter out is in that fourth watch. Right? We talked about that before. So there's some things that we see that's going on here, and we know that this entire time here is referred to as darkness. When Christ is not in the world, there is darkness. One of the things that we know today is sometime during this period before this even started, God reveals something in the book of Acts, chapter 9, specifically to the Apostle Paul. And what he does is he says, I'm going to do something in this period of time before that stuff takes place. Right? What God does through that mystery of Paul is not something that you can go back and find. And what God does is says, I'm going to place something right here before that stuff takes place. Okay? Before it even begins. Now there's some people that believe that the first 3.5 years of tribulation had already taken place. There's also some folks that believe that the entire 7-year period of tribulation has already taken place. Well, if either of those were right, if the one that says that it's already taken place, then that means we're in the kingdom, and I look around and I don't see what God promised to the nation of Israel through that kingdom. I don't see it. And if that's what it is, then I don't want any part of it. And we've mentioned that before. All right? And then if that was so that the first 3.5 years has already taken place, when did those things take place? Well, most everybody says 78 A.D., which doesn't work historically either. But as we go through here, notice he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. When other time was it that there was light, and there just all of a sudden was darkness, was when Christ was being judged for the sins of everybody. And what happens here is all of a sudden there's darkness upon the earth, and then Christ comes back. All right? As you go down through and you find out, you get down to verse 32. Verse 32, we see that parable of the fig tree, which we've already looked at. Well, what was it that took place after Christ talked about the parable of the fig tree is what? He talked about this, and we can put these things together and understand what's going on, and that's what we're dealing with. And then he starts talking about Matthew 24 about as it was in the days of Noah, and he says, here's how all this stuff's going to work out. Now, go get Psalm Psalm chapter 2. All right, Psalm chapter 2. So we read over here that the gospel is going to be preached and then tribulation, right? Notice Psalm chapter 2. Start off here in verse 1. Notice, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. Notice God's response. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, and the Lord shall have them in derision. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people, when they talk about, God must look down on the earth and just is sad by what His creation's done. And people will draw a picture or something like that and depict Him as crying, or Jesus Christ, they'll draw a picture of Him crying. Do you know what God's doing? He's laughing, thinking, you all think you've got stuff figured out and you have no clue what's going on. Notice, and the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall He speak unto them in His wrath, and vex them in His sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Now, when you read that, he's going to do what? He's going to speak unto them in His wrath and vex them in His sore displeasure. And He says, I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Notice He says, I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. You go over to Acts, and you've got Psalm 2 right there is quoted. And then we can find out when is it that God says, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, is with Christ's resurrection. You see that over in Acts. And it's really kind of fascinating when you see that. Notice He says, ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. When He says in verse 10, be wise now therefore, O ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. We talked about this before, last week in fact. Where is it that Christ is going to set up that throne is in that city. That city is in that land, and that land is here on the earth. And so then that's what we're dealing with, is we're dealing with all this stuff. That's why that tribulation period and all that stuff's taking place here. And, Scripture calls it it's the 70th week of Daniel. Scripture calls it the time of Jacob's trouble. And so then there's some things that we have that's taking place. One of the things that we've looked at before is during that midst, in the middle of that, Christ says to them to flee to the mountains. Okay? And there's some other things that we can get with that. Get Revelation chapter 7. Question?
No, you said in the midst of it, it says flee to the mountains, and then I remember you talked about how Jesus went to the mountains to pray. You know, during that thing down there.
I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, I could say that. I'd say that'd probably be something. I mean, he's actually talking about they're going to go to a physical mountain.
I know, but so did Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, and you know when we talk about, and we're going to look at it here in just a minute. When he comes back, we'll see that. Notice Revelation chapter 7. Start off here in verse 1. Revelation chapter 7, verse 1. And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor any tree. So there's a couple other things that I've noticed through here. You all see how we're just dealing with the 4 watches of the night here. Here you've got 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the what? The earth. Holding the 4 winds of the what? Earth. That the wind should not blow on the earth, right? So there's some things that we see here. The number of earth is 4, so it's kind of fascinating that we see that. That kind of makes sense why a lot of this stuff is we see 4 a lot as we go through here. You know, there's different things in numerology. 6, of course, being the number of man, and 3 being the number of God. It's just something that I've noticed as we've gone through here. Even in Daniel, the verse that we looked back at Daniel, there's some things that we could have looked at there with the number 4. But notice verse 2. And I saw another angel descending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. And of the tribe of Judah were sealed 12,000 of the tribe, and it goes on down. Verse 9. After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands, and cried with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb. So then, as we get over here, there's some things that we have taking place during this tribulation period. We see how it's going to end up, right? So then, as we take a look at this, there's some things that takes place along with that. Go back to Zechariah chapter 14. And so then, as we take a look at some of these things, we start seeing all this stuff come together, hopefully. So we have Christ die, buried, raised again, goes to sit at the right hand of God. We see in Acts chapter 7, Stephen looks up and sees Christ standing, because we know that he's going to come back to bring vengeance and strike through kings and all that stuff, and speak to them in his wrath and vex them with his sword, his pleasure, and we know all that stuff. Zechariah chapter 14. Notice in verse 4. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the what? Mount of Olives. Now, we could go through and we can find out in Acts when Christ is talking to him. You remember when he's ascended? You know where he ascends from? The Mount of Olives. And the angel comes and says, don't worry, he's going to come back in like manner. Well, he left from the Mount of Olives. Where is it that he comes back is the Mount of Olives. Well, what happens to the Mount of Olives? Notice what happens. And when his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. So then what happens is when he comes back and he gets foot on that, the Mount of Olives splits into two. And that's an amazing thing to think about. You know, that's one of those things. When Christ comes back for the church, the body of Christ, that doesn't happen. Right? Because he doesn't come back to the earth when he comes back to the church, the body of Christ, for the church, the body of Christ. So then that tells us that coming is different than his coming here for the church, the body of Christ, when the dispensation, the grace of God ends. And so then we know that those two things are different. So we know that we can place things where they're supposed to go. Notice he says, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a great valley, and half the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. And he continues on down through there. So there's some things when Christ comes back during that fourth watch. That's what I want us to see. There's something that will take place, and from that even time up through those 4 watches, when Christ comes back to Peter and the 11, or Peter and the 10, really at that time. When Christ comes back and they see him on the water, he's coming at the 4th night, right? So then we see that 4th night, that there's something that goes along with what's going on there. And of course that sea and the tribulation period go together, and we see that there's a timing with that. We don't know the time or the hour or anything like that. And the timings that I put on there are just kind of arbitrary. But I want us to see, what's the main issue that I want us to see is, when is he coming back? Is that fourth watch. Now, one last thing. Get Malachi. Get Malachi chapter 4. It's not chilly in here, so quit saying that. So get Malachi chapter 4, and we'll get Revelation here in a second. So Malachi chapter 4, verse 1. Malachi chapter 4, verse 1. We'll have a church split over who runs the thermostat. I'm just joking. Malachi chapter 4, verse 1. For behold, notice, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, all that do wickedly, shall be stubble. And the day cometh, and the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. Notice, but unto you that fear my name shall the what? Son of righteousness. Now that's not S-O-N, that's S-U-N, and that's a capital S-U-N. the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. Now there's some things that we need to make sure that we know and understand. The earthly ministry of Jesus Christ and then of the 12 was to go about doing what? One of the things that was part of their gospel presentation was to what? Preach that the gospel is at hand and heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, and all that stuff, right? So part of what they were doing was to take and show the nation of Israel, this is what you can look like when we get out here. So then there's a time when the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. So when he comes back, what's Christ going to have? Healing in his wings. What they're doing here is to prepare the nation of Israel for that kingdom where they're going to have everybody's going to be healed. There's not going to be a sickness. Go over to Revelation chapter 21. And this is one of those things as we take a look at some of this stuff, he wipes away the tears from our eyes, and there's no pain and sorrow and all that stuff out there. Notice, Revelation chapter 21, start off in verse 22. So this is after the new heaven and new earth. This is after that new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven and is placed here on earth, that true city, God's city, was going to come down. Verse 22, notice, and I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, notice, are the temple of it. There's not going to be a temple then. Notice verse 23, and the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it. Why? For the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. And he continues on down through that. So you have Christ is here. He's the light of the world. When he's gone, darkness. Paul tells us that we're in the darkness. In fact, he says it's high time, wake up out of your sleep and get to work during the nighttime because there's some things that's going to take place. But then when Christ comes back, what do they have? They have no need for the sun, the moon, stars, anything. You won't need fluorescent light in here. You won't have to open up a light or a window shade here. You're just going to have light. And the light's His glory. When we take a look at when Christ manifested Himself in the mountain, when Moses goes up to the mountain, he comes down and that they could see that he was in the presence of God. You think about those things. He can continue on. He says, and the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, and the kings of the earth do bring their glory and honor into it, and the gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, for there shall be no night there. So, do you know what God does in the very end? He gets rid of darkness. He gets rid of night. He gets rid of sea and everybody that's in it. Notice he says, and there shall, in verse 27, and there shall be in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination, or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. There's something that God's going to do out there in the world, and all this darkness is going to go away. And that's an amazing thing to think about as we go through this. So, one of the things that I was hoping that we would see is this tribulation period matches up with that time that they're on the sea. All right, and that fourth watch when Christ comes back, and they see Him walking is indicative of that His second coming, when He saves them immediately out of that. Questions? Comments? Concerns? It is a lot of information.
The new heaven and new earth is, that's some heavy stuff.
You know, even as the way that it says it in Revelation 21, where it says the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. What does that mean?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
What's he mean by passed away? Well, I mean, even then, he says he sees a new heaven and a new earth, for the first earth and first heaven and first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. It's just amazing to think about. Yeah, I don't know.
Where'd you just read that from? I was just right there.
Revelation 21.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There it is. Well, I just had this thought pop into my mind. I don't think it's what I'm thinking about. Because you think of there being three heavens,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think it's referring to the first heaven being where the birds are.
On this?
Yeah. That's
No. No.
So then why would he make a new heaven when the heaven that's there now is perfect?
Yeah. But so here's the thing. So you remember in Genesis 1:1 where it starts off, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth.
Yeah.
That's the first heaven. The first heaven, remember, is the third heaven, the second heaven, and that first heaven all together.
Yeah.
And there was no separation with that water at that time. So it was one heaven. So it's the entire thing. He's going to make over the entire thing and do away with the sea, do away with the stars, the moon, all that other stuff. So there is no reason for the first heaven where the birds fly around. There's no purpose for the second heaven where the stars are, and that's just one heaven again. So it would revert back to what he originally created it. And so that's how I wouldn't take it first heaven where the birds fly. He's going to redo this, but the first heaven, the very first heaven, in the beginning God created the heaven. That first heaven is what I would take that as. And the first earth. So in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and he's going to, it's really fascinating when you think about that, because he starts off, there's a purpose for that one heaven and that one earth. And so then something happened why that became three heavens. So there's some other things that we can talk about with that. Why is that way? And so we can talk about that sometime. But I would take that as the original creation of the heaven and the original creation of the earth. Those were the ones that he's talking about there. So then you wouldn't have the three anymore. It'd just be one like it was supposed to be.
I got you. I'll buy that.
Okay. Good. No, I'm just joking. Well, the bad thing is it's probably been different all 3 or 4 times we've done it too. Nope. But I mean, there were some other things in there that we talked about that even within this, that gets us thinking about something else too. So, Trying to figure out the next place to go, and I think what we might do is just do some topical things for a while. So like, because we've never done anything much of we've not looked specifically, especially on Sunday mornings, we've not looked specifically at prayer, right? We've not looked specifically at healing. We've not looked specifically at just, we kind of have baptism a little bit, but little things like that we want to make sure that we get. That way we can go from there. So. So that's what we'll start. Little topical things like this. It won't run 83 weeks.
There's a topic that I thought was pretty cool. Somebody else did like a year ago or maybe earlier this year. I can't remember because I didn't watch it. When Revelation was written.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of my life I thought it was 95 AD. And then since learning a lot of this stuff, it's like it had to have been before 70. And I think most people still believe it to be 95.
Yeah.
Can't have been. And how old would John have had to have been if it was in 95?
Yeah. About 90-something years old.
Yeah.
But then again, which John?
Dun, dun, dun. Stay tuned.
I mean, you also think too. People always wonder, the idea of who wrote Hebrews, that kind of thing. But then also, who wrote the book of John? Was it John?
Is that the one that
Or was it
what was his?
quite possibly Lazarus?
So you have listened to that.
Yeah.
We kind of touched on it a few years ago.
Yeah. David Reed.
David Reed and Brian Ross. I went blank there for a second.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. I think we talked about that when I listened to. Man, that's been like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. And for me, it's like if I've been dead for 3 or 4 days, I'm in Abraham's bosom, and then all of a sudden I disappear from there, and I stink to high heaven, and somebody's just raised me from the dead. That's going to be life-changing.
Yeah.
That's going to be really weird, not just for me because I've just come back to life.
Yeah.
Think about all the people that knew you were dead,
Mhm.
that knew you'd been dead for 3 or 4 days,
Yeah.
and raised you up, and you got raised up. And you got to figure, Lazarus had to have been his biggest fan.
Yeah.
At that point, he knew, all the other guys had
Well,
been following.
the phrase "the disciple that whom Jesus loved," that's what it goes to, and Lazarus was the one that he loved,
Yeah.
and so that's why a lot of people say that he was the one that wrote the book of John.
I know we talked about that, and you didn't act like you really.
I've never-
Like you're like, yeah, whatever.
No, it's not that. It's just at that time, because I remember us talking about that. That was quite a time ago. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I've not personally myself set it out. I've watched other people. That's why I said I know some people say this. I'm not sure. I've not studied it out for myself. That's just like somebody asked if we know that Paul didn't write the book of Hebrews, which I don't believe Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, and there's a bunch of reasons why. I was talking to, I think it was Tom Burchett. I think it was. Or no. It's either him or David Reed. I can't remember. Anyway, I could kind of see Timothy being the one that wrote Hebrews. But we were talking about it, and I think he was saying that it might be Luke, maybe? I don't know.
Timothy's mom was Jewish.
Yeah. And I mean, some of the phrasings, which a lot of people, they say the reason why they think Paul wrote it is some of his phrasings are in there. Well, who would have known Paul's phrasings more than anybody would have been Luke and Timothy. Because Luke was with him a lot, and so was Timothy. So either one of those two. And again, that's one of those, I might throw you out if you say Paul wrote Hebrews, but if you said Luke or Timothy, I don't care. No, I'm just joking.
I'm convinced that Paul did.
Well, the reason most people that do say that Paul wrote Hebrews, the reason why is they also believe that God chastens you if you do something wrong. And that's where they go get it, is the book of Hebrews. Stam was that way. When you read things that differ, the latter part of his book is dealing with Hebrews and the chastening that we go through because he believes Paul wrote Hebrews. Most of the people that believe that not only does God chasten you, but also is directly intervening in your life through circumstances, they also believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. And the reason they do believe that is so that it fits the doctrine, honestly. That's the only reason they do. It's because it fits their doctrine. But Delilah and I went through the book of Hebrews years ago, and we came up with a list. I don't even remember how many we had. A list of verses that proves Paul couldn't have written it. That was when we first left Old Bethel back in 2004.
We go
Yeah.
through Romans through Philemon, it all says Paul.
Yeah.
But Hebrews says God.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he says, and Paul even says, as the way he writes every one of his epistles is the same salutation, or maybe.
He acknowledges himself in Romans through Philemon, not
Yeah.
Hebrews.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it.
Yeah. And that works for me. That's enough for me. But there's other things too. But yeah, those are things. I mean, even with something like this, if somebody comes along and says, "Greg, you're a nut," I don't believe that. I'm fine with that. I mean, this is fun stuff to me.
Yeah.
It's thick, heavy, fun stuff, but it's still fun stuff, I think. And even with the dating of Paul's epistles when he wrote them, a lot of people fuss and fight about that. Honestly, they're in the Bible the way they're supposed to be, so I go by that. Now, is there something you can gain from understanding when he wrote things? Yes, you can understand. But most people that make a big deal out of that don't understand his Acts ministry anyway. So, anyway. All right. So we good? Everybody thoroughly confused? Nice. That was my goal. No. So now I got to think what we're going to start on Wednesday night, now that we're done with that overview. I don't know. We'll see. All right. So thank you all for being here. Folks online, if you're still with us, thanks for joining us. And June 21st, get here. We'll feed you. Just get here. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to study your word. May we take the information that we've studied out today, study it out for ourselves in our own personal Bible study, that we can come to a clearer knowledge and understanding of your word, that we can gauge some of the information and put things together where they belong, that we can understand the timeline that you work through a little bit more, that we might come to a clearer knowledge and understanding of your word, that we might be able to live a life glorifying to you, and it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.